Without further ado, Michael, if you would, roll tape.
Our main objectives are to invite the societies in which we live to think about Islam as an alternative way of life, to command good and forbid evil wherever we are, and ultimately as well to establish the Sharia on state level, which is the Khilafah system of governance, in order to be a beacon again in the world, an example of how people should live their lives.
The faith is really instilled in invest in the hereafter. And if people emancipate themselves from that concept of the hereafter, that is the true emancipation of the Muslim, lies in shedding the fear of what is going to happen to you in the grave and after the grave. Then people will be able to reasonably think about, maybe like you, retaining part of their faith and their culture, but giving up jihad, giving up violence, and giving up Sharia, the rule, the politics of Islam.
Okay, Raheel, to you first. Ayan Hirsi Ali wants Islam rejected as a religion. She thinks it's absolutely the wrong way to go. The other speaker, Anjem Chaudhry, wants the whole world to embrace Islam. He'd like the crescent moon to be flying over the White House. If you're not one of these two, are you by default a moderate Muslim?
I personally have difficulty with labels, Steve. So I'll tell you that this idea, the word moderate, I think was coined after 9/11 by people trying to understand what makes Muslims tick. It's not really a label that I put on myself. I look upon this, there are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. They're Muslim because they believe in the submission to God, the Shahada, the witness, and that makes them Muslim, and there's no one really who can say that they're not. A person who calls themselves Muslim is a Muslim.
I understand
so
that, but every other religion can say whether they're Orthodox or moderate or conservative or Reform or whatever.
Yes, but you don't hear the term moderate Jew or moderate Christian. This seems to have been coined specifically for Muslims and by others. So I would call myself a Muslim. Now we have to talk about the ideology, and as Ayan Hirsi Ali said, there is an ideology of political Islamization, which is, the wackos, the nut jobs, they absorb that. That is where the danger is. And there is the ideology, which is the spiritual ideology. And that spiritual ideology, I think, if I, as a Muslim, follow the essence of the spiritual message of Islam, by default, I have to be moderate and balanced and progressive.
All right, let's take as a granted tonight, as a given, that we all hate labels. But we're all trying to get a better understanding of sort of where you and the Muslim world is on the political spectrum. Mubin, for example, if these are the two bookends, where are you on that continuum?
Yeah, definitely not on either of those sides. Moderate in the English word itself presupposes somewhere in between two polar opposites. Those are definitely two polar opposites.
Are you closer to one than the other?
I'm going to start from the middle, and I'll see where I end up after that.
You're a good old Canadian, even more Ontarian, right in the middle of the road.
That's right.
But you're not going to tell us whether you're closer to one side or the other.
Well, I mean, I am definitely pro-faith. I'm not one to reject my faith. I encourage people of all faiths to express their faith, not to hide it and suppress it, because we all know what happens when you forcibly suppress identity that's inherently there. So I'm totally pro-identity, totally pro-faith, and I encourage people of all faiths to express that. But I think the easy definition of a moderate is one who lives and lets live.
Lives and lets live. Okay. Well, Tariq, let me pursue this with you a little bit. I want to take you back to your days in Pakistan when you were is it fair to say, a self-avowed Marxist back in the day?
No, I was a Marxist.
You were a Marxist, yes. Okay. Can you be a Marxist and a Muslim at the same time?
Oh, the earliest Marxists in Islam go back to, considering that ideology, go back to the 7th century. There's a very rich tradition, both in the Arab world and India, of the Red Mullahs. In fact, the first Communist Party of India Congress was chaired by Maulana Hasrat Mohani, a very well-respected Islamic scholar. This division of secularism as non-religion is a European construct of secularism. Indian secularism, where I find my tradition, is based on a separation of religion and politics. The first Indian education minister was Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, one of the leading theologians of the 20th century in India, and the gentleman who laid the foundations of India's education system under Jawaharlal Nehru.
So the answer is yes, there's nothing inconsistent with being a Marxist and a Muslim.
No, it's not.
Okay. Mohammed, the question of how politics is related to religious beliefs is a matter of some contention. Want to help us out with that? What's at issue there?
Well, I think it's complicated. Any kind of theistic religion like Islam, Christianity, or Judaism that has a specific content, especially the way it regulates human conduct and human behavior, is going to have to take some sort of stance vis-a-vis governmental authorities, because governments have a tendency to regulate human behavior. Religions have a tendency to regulate human behavior. So just as governments are going to formulate some sort of policy toward religions, religions are going to formulate a policy toward governments. So on the one hand, while in liberalism, generally, we don't want religion to capture the state, so too we don't want the state to capture religion, right? So we want to maintain some kind of constitutional structure that respects the independence and integrity of each.
How are we doing on that front?
I think in Canada, typically, Canada's doing a good job on it, but that doesn't mean there aren't political pressures that would go toward subverting, I think, the integrity of both government and the state. And unfortunately, I think in the hands of many, the label of moderate Muslim is used precisely to do that as a quasi-inquisitorial device to try to test Muslims to see whether they believe the right things politically in order to enjoy, sort of as a ticket, in order to enjoy full rights as citizens. And I think that's a problem with the label moderate Muslim.
You see that, Raheel?
I definitely believe in a separation of the mosque and the state. I'll state that right off the top of my head. But on the other hand, I believe that faith is a very private matter. And in the Muslim world, we're not doing very well with this idea of separation of the mosque and state. And these two streams that I talked about in the beginning in the Muslim world, which is Islamism, which is political Islam, and the spiritual message, are sort of, that is where this clash of civilizations is taking place. And those who are the Islamists who want to impose their political ideology in all aspects of Muslim life are imposing their will on the rest, and the rest are not speaking out. So there is certainly a silent majority of Muslims. In Pakistan, where I grew up and where I come from, my family, works 9 to 5. They go, they pray. Their prayers are a private matter. They are Muslims, but they're really not involved in this discussion, perhaps, that whether you're a moderate Muslim or not.
Why not?
That's very far removed for them, because for them, this is, moderation is supposed to be the way of life for them. So it's not a subject that comes up often. They're not involved in the politics of the faith. But then there are these large groups of Islamists who are very involved, not only in the politics of the faith for themselves, but on imposing it on everyone else and making the rest of the world into a caliphate. And that's a huge problem.
Mubin, I want to follow up with you on that issue of faith, because you said you were a person of faith and you thought faith was at the foundation of this. There are lots of people in this world who think you can be a good Jew and never step foot into a synagogue or read the Torah. Can you say the same thing about Islam? Can you be a good Muslim and not be connected to the Quran?
You cannot, well, you have to be connected to the Quran. The Quran is the primary source document of Islam. To reject that is to,
But in the same way the Torah is the primary document for Jews, or the Bible would be for Christians, you can be disconnected from those books and still be considered a good Jew, a good Christian. Can you say the same thing about Islam?
Well, it depends on what you mean by disconnected. Like, you have, let's pick on certain verses in the Quran, right? You may have certain understandings that, my personal view is that, a number of verses were indicative of a time and place. So, for example, when written contracts were to be put to paper, one man and 2 men, and if not 2 men, then 1 man and 2 women, so that the second may remind the first. So people took that to mean, women's testimony is half of a man, which is false. What this referred to was a time in which people were not very literate.
Okay, but I'm going to stop you there, because you're going through chapter and verse with me, and I think you're not addressing.
Well, then let me just keep it.
Steve.
Yeah, Muhammad, give it a shot.
Okay. Again, according to Orthodox Islam, like I was saying earlier, there's certain kinds of conduct that's prescribed. One basic element of conduct in the life of an Orthodox Muslim is daily prayer, right? 5 daily prayers, right? Part of the daily prayers is to recite certain verses from the Quran. So part of the daily discipline of being a Muslim is to recite the Quran. Of course, there are lots and lots and lots of Muslims who don't do this, right? Now, theologians have long discussions about what is the status of, let's say, non-observant Muslims, okay? Generally, what theologians have said is they've made a distinction between 2 categories of people. One who, they're just lazy, okay? They'd rather go play golf, go to the beach, watch a movie, etc., than pray, okay? But they recognize that they're under an obligation to pray, they just don't do it, okay? So they're sinners. And presumptively, right, there's the hope that God will forgive them for that. Then there's another category who deny the obligation entirely. Now, denying the obligation entirely entails rejection of the idea of religion.
And that's
right?
worse, presumably.
Yes, that's heresy. Right?
That's heresy.
Yes.
That's death.
Yeah.
That's death.
That's death. That's apostasy. This is, you see, we're having the wrong discussion here. The issue becomes that in this day and age, where we have the nation state, what is the role of religion in determining citizenship? You cannot be a moderate Muslim if you believe and you have not yet renounced the doctrine of armed jihad. It's simple, very simple as that. You cannot be a moderate Muslim if you consider, for example, Mubin Sheikh to be a traitor to Canada, whereas he's a person who deserves an order of Canada for busting the biggest terror plot in this country.
The Toronto 18.
Toronto 18. I use a very simple methodology. If you consider Mubin Sheikh to be a traitor, you're not a moderate Muslim. If you consider him to be your hero, even if you disagree with him, then you're committed to this country and you are a moderate Muslim. There are a number of other factors. People who, even today in the United States of America, in Britain, are not on the side of the lunatic you showed, who came openly on the camera and said, we want to establish Sharia. There is a vast majority in the mosque structure that wishes to impose Sharia law, but are smart enough to not say that and spin it according to the doctrine of the Muslim Brotherhood by sliding it under the surface and then seeking protection under the freedom of religion. But the agendas of the Islamists are the same. Some are hardcore Islamists, others are very sophisticated third-generation Canadians who are here primarily to disrupt Western civilization.
But you put the case the choice quite starkly to Mubin, and I'm, you know, for those who don't know, I think it's probably a good opportunity right now for you to explain why you made the choice you made for Canada, as opposed to for the more, I guess, orthodox wings of your religion, which may be upset with the choice you made. Explain why you did it.
Yeah, well, this is something that I learned from being a very idealistic Muslim type, young, angry Muslim kid. I had very fantastical ideas, like Anjum Chaudhry is a perfect example. This guy, he lives in a fantasy world. The Quran itself doesn't say that all people are going to be Muslim. God says that, you know, some people will be, some people won't be. So for me, it was very easy. There's something fundamentally wrong about plotting to blow up targets in Canada. And I learned this lesson the hard way, that a lot of people in the community, they didn't like the fact that I exposed wrongdoing in the community. And I understand that. A lot of communities are like that, especially communities that feel that, you know, they're under siege.
They think you chose your country over your faith.
Well, I don't think so. I think my faith is what drove me to do what I did. In fact, you know, I had religious scholars give me blessings to go ahead and do what I did. So, I mean, to anybody who would say that there is a dichotomy between the two, just they're nut jobs.
He's being nice to some of the scholars because there are very few of the scholars who would come up openly and say, this Friday congregation in the mosque, we will be talking to Mubin Sheikh.
Steve, I want to pick up on something that you had said, which is very important to me as a Muslim, is the idea that if one calls himself a Muslim, really there's nobody, no other human being that can say that they're not. You know, it's a very simple thing. There is a lot going on, again, in the Islamist agendas of calling people non-Muslims just because they don't agree with them. And Muslims do this too. You'll hear many Muslims say, well, those terrorists, they're really not Muslims. And that's a problem because they are. You know, a lot of the actions they do it in the name of the faith. So we can't distance ourselves just because we don't want to sully our hands and say that they're part of the faith. It's like copping out by saying, no, no, no. All this bad stuff that's being done, those people, they're really not Muslims. They are, because anyone who calls themselves Muslim is a Muslim. And this idea of blasphemy where, you know, we put these huge fatwas on people and say, you know, they're not Muslim and they're not Muslim, and it's happened to me as well, when they don't like what I say, I'm not Muslim. No one can judge that.
Well, let me follow up with this, because it may be difficult to define what a Muslim is, but apparently it's not so hard to define what a Muslim is not. And to that end, I want to quote Max Boot, who is writing in the book, Are We Winning the War on Terror? This is from a couple of years ago. Michael, if you would, let's bring this graphic up. The best case for Muslim moderation comes in Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. It's a book which came out in 2008. Having conducted a 6-year survey of tens of thousands of Muslims in more than 35 countries, the authors conclude that only 7% that is, those who say that the 9/11 attacks were completely justified, are politically radicalized. It is comforting to think that 93% of Muslims are moderates. But even if this is true, it still gives us 91 million radicals out of 1.3 billion Muslims worldwide. However, if one adds the number of Muslims who think that 9/11 was largely or partly justified, the proportion jumps to 13.5%, a gain of 78 million radicals. Adding those who say that the attacks were in some way justified would yield another 300 million Muslims for a total of 36.6%. Which figure gives a better picture of Muslim extremism, 7% or 36.6%? Want to help us with that, Mohammed?
Well, listen, I think part of the problem here is that, with basically this whole panel, the idea of moderate Muslim is it conflates theological questions with political questions, right? I think it's very important that, again, going back to basic principles of liberal democracy has two elements to it. One, we want to have political neutrality. We also want to have religious integrity, right? So you have to have room for both. Just as we demand of religions not to try to capture the state, we demand of the state not to try to define the content of religion. Here we already see that there are attempts to sort of breach that. Secondly, here now, this is an attempt to conflate religious belief with political beliefs. Mm-hmm. What I take from this evidence is that a third of the Muslim world is highly alienated from the United States and thinks that to some extent or another, harming the United States is partially justified.
So you wouldn't read more into it than that?
I wouldn't read more into it than that. We cannot conflate political grievances and political sort of a political desire to exact harm on the United States into religious extremism simply because the people are Muslim and express their grievances in a religious language.
Tariq.
Well, first of all, that survey was done by a very prominent supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood working with Gallup poll, Dalia Mujahid, who now even writes speeches for Barack Obama and was instrumental in sending him to Egypt to address people.
Sorry, does that mean the figures are illegitimate? Or
yes, I would question them. And I would rather rely on the Environic survey done a few years ago in Canada, in which 13% of Muslim Canadians suggested that the Toronto 18 had a justification to carry out the terrorist attack. Now, whether it was 13 or 10, somewhere around that figure, that means in this country, there are 100,000 Muslims, young men actively involved in considering Canada as their enemy. That would be okay if the rest of the 900,000 were up in arms against them. What's happening is that because of a phenomenon called Muslim patriotism, even those folks who know that the Toronto 18 were wrong are silent. Their objections are, there are two teams into this. There is the Muslim team and there's the other team. And contrary to what they say when the mics and cameras are on, they are saying different things when they are shut and they are in their own. It's a highly explosive mixture. We've known that with the latest Montreal terrorist attack, the dancing doctor. We know about the Digibomber. We know about the Toronto 18. It keeps happening. And yet we shut our eyes because I think the rest of Canada just doesn't understand the phenomena of who we are dealing with.
Let me get Mubin's take on this. Which number do you think more accurately conveys that which we are discussing here today, the 7 or the 36?
No, again, I'm not going to sign off on the numbers. I'm going to agree with Professor Fadl in the sense that we do conflate the two. When, for example, if you look at academic studies on political violence, and you see that if, let's say, Muslims are committing political violence, all of a sudden, Islam teaches terrorism. But when other people commit the same type of political violence, we don't mention their religion.
Double standard?
So I do see a double standard, but I will grant that there are ideological motivators behind some of that political violence, but a lot of times the reasons for that political violence is just regular reasons that other people use when they also commit political violence.
You mean the doctrine of jihad doesn't account for the motivation of Islamic terrorists?
Yeah, okay, so if we were to, so it would follow then that if we took out the doctrine of armed jihad, there would be no terrorism.
No.
But yet
no,
when you see the first Muslim terrorist act, if you want to say after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, was the Marine barrack bombing in 1983. It was the first use of the suicide bombing.
This was in Lebanon.
In Lebanon, that's right. So the question is, where were all the Muslim terrorists before 1983?
No, I will tell you where they were. They were in Central Asia in the 10th, 9th, and 11th century.
Well, 10th, 9th, 11th centuries compared to 1983, that's like hundreds and hundreds of years of a gap, right? We have to explain that gap.
Mubin, the doctrine of armed jihad from the 8th century onwards has been a serious diversion from what it was in the Quran. The Umayyads dynasty, and people can gloss over it, the fact that every member of the Umayyad ruling family was slaughtered in Damascus, the fact that every dynasty that goes to another one ends up in the total mass killing of the secondary dynasty, and done in the name of Islam.
So it's not a new phenomenon.
One second. The point being that in all this Muslim on Muslim violence, every time the oppressor has invoked a doctrine of armed jihad, this is not the Prophet, this is not the Quran, this is the Sharia law that we are, as Muslims, are fighting the Islamists. We do not wish to have it.
Let me get
around
Raheel
us.
on this.
When these percentages that you talk about is something that Muslims generally will fall back upon as a defense. They always say, well, you know, the terrorists, the extremists, are only 1% of the population. Well, that's a very large number. The problem is, and they wield an awful lot of influence, because the rest of the, if they say 99%, are not speaking out. They're not speaking up against what's happening. And if we are talking about where the violence came from, let me take one step even further back, if we have to be honest as Muslims. It was only 60 years after the death of the Prophet when there was an error in transmission and the first violence took place by Muslims against Muslims. The grandson of the Prophet was brutally massacred and beheaded by people who call themselves Muslims. And so that idea has still retained, because Muslims are living in the self-denial where they're not willing to talk about it, they're not willing to openly discuss it, and this is a fact that all Muslims accept. This is his history.
He's getting increasingly
I think
frustrated
this is
with
really a really interesting lesson and, I guess, trivia of ancient Islamic history for your audience. I don't think it has anything to do with
Let's let him finish.
100 plus years.
Excuse me. Ladies and gentlemen, hang on. We have to let him finish his thought, please. Okay. Mohammed, finish your thought, please.
I mean, these are facts that most Muslims don't even know about, right?
Please, come on.
We must let him finish his statement.
Oh, please.
So I don't see what sort of causal relationship it has to the kind of polling data that ostensibly we were talking about. So again, what I'm saying here is we're actually witnessing the problem when we have our friends here criticizing Islamist groups for conflating theology and politics. They're doing it all the time, right? They're attributing this violence to some sort of theological issues that we're going to fix. I think what we do is we solve political problems. When you solve political problems, the theology follows, right? If you don't solve the politics, the theology is never going to get right.
Okay, let's get some reaction. Go ahead.
The grievances. Political violence is largely driven by grievances, political grievances, whatever you want to call them. And I mean, I think it is agreed upon by the overwhelming majority of scholars on terrorism or political violence that when the grievances are dealt with, you'll see the terrorists go away. Now, nobody's saying that they will completely be eliminated. That's just not possible. We're dealing with human beings. But there are legitimate grievances that are at play. And these grievances, the thing is that you'll notice that they have to go back to hundreds and hundreds of years ago.
No.
I'm just saying,
go back to current time.
Well, we're talking about modern times. We're
Absolutely.
in 2010. This is obviously in the context of the 9/11 attacks, 2001. And I just put 1983 as the first suicide bombing Islamist attack. So I'm looking at the political context, and there have been a lot of changes and a lot of grievances that have arisen, and that's why we're seeing more of this political violence.
Okay, Tarek?
You think Daniel Pearl was born in the 8th century? This guy was slaughtered like a goat by a person who went to the London School of Economics, who was a filthy rich person. He was a British-born, top student, went to Pakistan, slaughtered a journalist. Why? Because he was a Jew. You know, every day in Pakistan, 12 people are beheaded and killed. Why? Because one group of Muslims has determined that the other group of Muslims are not Muslims. We have today a situation in Egypt. We have a situation in Arabia. We have a situation in Algeria where 100,000 people were killed. Women they had their heads cut off because they were not wearing headscarves. Acid is being thrown on the faces of women who don't wear niqab in Kashmir and Bangladesh. We are living in a denial, and my friends over here seem to think that just because they say it's not there.
Let me just put that to Muhammad. I appreciate you're trying to make the distinction between the religious and the political, but it sounds like in much of the Islamic world, they are conflated.
I don't know if we're talking about here in Canada, or talking about Bangladesh, or Algeria,
Sounds like
or
we're
Saudi
talking
Arabia. We're
about all
going
of the
all
above.
over the place, right? This discussion is totally free-flowing, right?
It should be.
And so what we need to do is talk about every place with its own special circumstances. Now, I agree with Tariq to a certain extent that obviously the presence of a doctrine like jihad is relevant. But what I would point out, why is it relevant? Because Muslims, generally speaking, right, don't believe in violence. So when they are going to engage in violence, they have to justify it. What's the label that they use? Jihad. Now, if they are not Muslim, if they're secularists, do we really believe that there are no secular, violent, revolutionary movements in the world? That's absurd, right? So there'll be a different set of justifications. The fact that they're Muslims, they're going to resort to what's available to them in their language of justification. If they weren't Muslims, right, if they became Marxists, they would adopt something else, right?
Raheel?
So it's really, I think, at the end of the day, the causative relationship is quite narrow.
Causative relationship is what is so important. When you have a group of people who are using the theology and the faith to perpetuate violence against others, against those who they believe are infidels, suppression of women to such a large extent that the latest statistics show that there were almost 1,000 women a year killed in honor killings in Pakistan, and this is being used as part of the faith, and the younger men are forgiven under the doctrine of qisas. We have the doctrine of armed jihad, which has grown tremendously since 9/11. If they're using the faith as the ideology to perpetuate this violence, then certainly we have to look at the basis and the foundation. It is not the faith that's teaching them that, but certainly somewhere they have lost, as I said, that transmission. And let me please finish here one moment. There have been two streams of thought. The political Islamists use faith as their reason to perpetuate this violence. They never stand up and say, we are doing this for political reasons. They're doing it for Islam. So they are hijacking my faith when they're doing that. I'm not saying that this is what Islam teaches, but they are using Islam to perpetuate their violence.
I obviously agree with you that it's critical and important to sort of refute false doctrines. But what I'm trying to say analytically, from an objective perspective of policy, it's not the job of governments to go around expounding what true theological doctrine is and false theological doctrine is. The policy of governments, is to set good policies, right?
Absolutely.
And that's what we need to talk about, right? Not about whether this doctrine of jihad is correct or false,
Okay,
et cetera,
let me put something else on the table
I
here
can
then,
do that as
because
a private Muslim, but I can't do that as a policymaker.
Let me put a new idea on the table here for a second, because you said where in the world are we talking? Well, let's bring it home for a second. Okay. One of the ways in which some say extremists and moderates are separated is on the issue of Sharia law.
Absolutely.
We had a discussion here in the province of Ontario some years ago.
We had a discussion?
Well,
we didn't have a discussion.
The Liberal caucus had a discussion about it, and the Premier decided there ought not to be.
There was no discussion, but continue,
But
please.
okay, no, all right, well, that's a fair point. You think there was, we have not had a debate about this?
We have not had a debate. It was a fear-mongering, almost a comical understanding of Sharia law. The Anwar Ayman professor at U of T, I mean, I could just see him cringing at. It was a comical understanding, and I'm going to make it very quickly, very brief. Look, if we're attempting to reform, quote unquote, a target community, let's call it the Muslim community, it is incumbent on us to use the language that they understand, the principles and mechanisms that they understand. I practice Sharia law in family mediation and arbitration. The courts send Muslim disputants that have issues with disputes that they may have which have religious basis or religious inclination. The courts, who don't want to get involved in religion, send the people to mediators.
Still?
Of course. Yeah, mandatory mediation is a part of this, is the part of the legal system. And they send people to, now, we are an exception to the rule.
Let me understand this.
Yeah.
Let me understand this.
Oh, yes.
Because my understanding was Premier McGuinty made a decision that Sharia law is no longer an option in the province of Ontario for settling disputes in the Muslim community.
Under the Arbitration Act. Now, it's not being done under the Arbitration Act. Here, it's very simple.
So it's just being done.
It's being done. Let me finish this point.
He finishes and then Tariq.
When two disputants to a legal hearing or motion, whatever, when they've had legal advice, when the lawyers themselves are participants in the mediation, the judge and the court is satisfied that the rights have been extended to all the people, the options have been made available, and when those people decide to use X mechanism versus Y mechanism,
they're allowed to.
They're allowed to.
Yeah. Tarek.
This is a sort of a spin that came out straight during the debates. The agenda was to get state validation to Sharia law.
Which there is not.
Which there's not. Our objection to Sharia law was because we recognized who was introducing it. We also recognized that the former Minister of Religious Affairs from Pakistan had taken up shop in Canada. We presented the documents which said this is the gateway. You build a bridgehead in Canada to introduce Sharia law then as a practice for expanding it.
Okay, but I guess the question becomes, if you believe that Sharia law ought to be an option.
Just a second. All Muslims live under Sharia law. We get married under Sharia, we die under Sharia. That's not the issue. The issue was a debate that people wanted to deflect. They wanted the Canadian state to validate Sharia law. Our objection was that we've seen it validated in Iran and Saudi Arabia, and we are not going to allow criminal activity to be over here.
But for the purposes of our discussion tonight, as we try to determine who's a Muslim moderate and who is an extremist, I want to know, Mohammed, let me pick up. Can you say if you think Sharia law ought to be used as an option in the province of Ontario?
I think the question
then you're not a moderate.
Hold on.
Can you say that?
See, I think that's exactly the wrong way of asking the question. The question is, what do our laws permit, right? When you look in the area of family law permits a wide area of freedom. It basically operates as what lawyers call as a default regime. So when you enter into a marriage in Ontario, if you don't enter into a prenuptial agreement, there are all these rules that apply to your relationship with your spouse. However, you have the freedom to enter into a prenuptial agreement that totally varies the rights of under the Family Law Act. Now, it seems to me that if that's the structure of the family law regime in Ontario, then there's no principled basis on which you can say Muslims are not free to enter into prenuptial agreements on the basis of their own religious understandings.
Unless those religious understandings violate the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Exactly. Now, this is the point. This is why the arbitration debate was so problematic. I think it says more about Canadians' lack of trust in Canadian institutions than it does about so-called bogeyman of the Sharia. Because if arbitration is vindicated, you're not vindicating the Sharia, you're vindicating the Canadian public law. Because an arbitration order does not go into effect until a court has approved it. When a court approves it, that means that this order of the arbitrator is consistent with Canadian public law, right? And so if you're saying that Sharia is this bogeyman, what you're saying is that Canadian courts are incompetent.
So your point is that you can be a believer in Sharia law, having application in the province of Ontario, and be a moderate Muslim.
You can be a perfectly moderate Muslim when that's understood as adhering to the laws of Canada.
Raheel has not weighed in on this yet, please.
Yes, I don't know whether you want to call me a moderate Muslim or not, but as a woman, I will certainly say I'm totally against the idea of Sharia law being implemented in Ontario at all. And I'll tell you why. I made a one-hour documentary on Sharia in which my friend Mobeen Sheikh has spoken very eloquently in favor of Sharia law and what he does. Let me also tell you that in this process, I saw this so-called arbitration that takes place under the table. It's almost always men, and it's almost always not in favor of the women. You know, they perform divorces. I have been there and I have seen that. You know, they do child custody issues. I believe in one system of law. That is all that is required here. And if I need it ever, I will go to the Canadian system of law.
You can't arbitrate child custody, just to be clear.
No, Steve, the issue is, this is a larger problem of the Muslim Brotherhood operating over here. You go to downtown Toronto, you see the Muslim Brotherhood booklets of Sayyid Qutb, Sayyid Maududi being distributed. These names are not familiar to most Canadians, but these are Islamofascists who have inflicted enormous pain on the rest of the Muslim world. Wherever there is a slaughter, whether 500,000 Darfuris have died or whether Pakistanis killed 1 million Bangladeshi Muslims, invariably the dirty hand of the Islamofascist Muslim Brotherhood folks trying to implement Sharia has been found.
Tariq,
The evidence is there.
The Pakistani army invaded Bangladesh and killed a million people. How does that have, what does that have to do with Sayyid Qutb, who was executed, executed in 1965?
No, come on, it was not even 1965. Look,
Yes,
Muhammad, just a second.
1965.
No, it wasn't. Muhammad, you've got to get your history right.
Can we bring it back to Canada for a second and the moderate Muslim in Canada?
I need one at a time. Please finish your
The point is, the same Muslim Brotherhood is operating in the UFT. They've got a unit right over here where we speak.
How do you know?
You want to come with me?
How do you know? No, just tell me how you know.
Well, the fact remains that there are organizations of the Muslim Brotherhood in UFT, in urban schools. I know the people involved. These are the guys who wanted Sharia law in this province. The evidence is there into what they said during the Sharia law. We have the written statements of every Islamic organization that was for Sharia law and against Sharia law.
And they are not moderates in your view?
Oh, absolutely not. If you want Sharia law validated by a Western state, and if your inspiration comes...
Hang on. He just said that you can be...
One second.
He just said that you can be... Muhammad just said...
He can say whatever he wishes
No, but I
to.
just want you to speak to what he said, which is you can be for Sharia law and be a moderate Muslim. And you're saying that's impossible.
My point is, the Sharia law that he wants to introduce over here, and he's not admitting, it comes from Sayyid Qutb. It comes from the booklets of Maududi, Jamaat-e-Islami, and the Muslim Brotherhood. The Sharia law that his father practices in his mosque in mediation has been going on, what, 15 years? I was part of that trying to help set up that mosque at that time. I don't have a problem people practicing Sharia or practicing the religion. The devil in the detail.
The people that are doing it.
Absolutely.
Like Raheel was saying,
What I'm saying is the state cannot validate it.
I understand.
don't participate in any mosques. I have no dog in this hunt in any institution. The issue is what Canadian law says, right? All I'm trying to point out is that in the case of family law, not just family law, most areas of our private life we can structure through contract and other kinds of consensual agreement, right? And so if we say that Muslims aren't allowed to structure their own law, their own private lives in accordance with their own religious values and have those contracts and agreements honored in court, then we are discriminating against them.
Okay.
And that violates, in my opinion, the values of Canadian law.
Let me do a little business here because we're down to our last 15 minutes. We want to remind everybody we're at the Monk School of Global Affairs on the downtown campus of the University of Toronto tonight. We are at the last Thursday of every month. This is our home away from home. We're talking tonight about who is a moderate Muslim. And we want to let you know that our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, is online right now, moderating a chat at tvo.org/theagenda. Look at the Inside Agenda Producers blog. And if you want to weigh in on some of the issues that we've been discussing here tonight, you can do it online at the website. I want to remind you that after 9 o'clock Eastern Time, we're going to continue the discussion by putting your comments, your questions to our four guests. So dial us up right now, and you can start to put those questions and comments in there right now so that you can have direct access to the guests. tvo.org/theagenda. Mohammed.
Sorry. But and I just want to follow up on the last thought I was trying to make. And it's a total red herring, this business about the Muslim Brotherhood or not Muslim Brotherhood. Our rights in Canada do not depend on our political affiliation. If my agreement is a lawful agreement, it doesn't matter if I'm in the Muslim Brotherhood or some sort of Christian evangelical group or some sort of atheist group or anything. The issue is my contract valid and lawful, and the court should recognize it because I'm a citizen.
I get you.
Full story.
We want to
Full
save
stop.
some time for the people who were kind enough to come out tonight to get into this as well. Hi, sir. Go ahead.
Hi. Let's talk about just Canada. Say that there's at least 100,000 Muslims in Canada. I rarely see any imams on these panels. In Canada, who speaks for Islam?
That's a tough question. Okay, Mubin, who speaks for Islam in Canada?
Sure. Well, certainly not the mosque authorities and mosque establishment. I think we can get them out of the way. And really,
why do you say that?
Well, I think there is a desire for authority. We kind of try to look for an Islamic diocese, as there is in Catholicism, and there is not. And so, really, who does speak for Islam? If you know, please let me know.
Tariq, who speaks for Islam?
I think every Muslim speaks for himself and his Islam. If there are 1 million Muslims in Canada, there are 1 million Islams.
No, but when you ask who speaks for Catholicism, you go to the Pope.
You were talking about a different religion. We are not Windows 95 coming out of 3.1. We are a religion that's very different. We don't have a clergy. That is what attracted people to Islam. And ever since the Damascus palaces that the Umayyads captured, they got enamored by the Eastern Orthodox revelry and the cloaks. These imams, if Muhammad the Prophet came here, he wouldn't understand what the mosque structure is today. But there are decent people who've come on this show. Imam Shabir Ali has been on this show. He's a gentleman, a scholar, and a genuinely good person who is sort of my inspiration. If I have a question, that's the person I go to. His father runs a mosque in the west end of Toronto, an absolute gentleman and a scholar. There are a number of people. The trick is, if the mosque looks too expensive, there's a problem. If it is low-income neighborhood, it is a genuine...
What's the problem if it looks too expensive?
If it's got, then it's got $15 million from Saudi Arabia pulled into it. There are mosques over here that are getting millions of dollars from the Qatar Foundation. You could tell more about that, but
Let me
Go ahead,
put
Raheel.
in my 2 bits. I am, after all, the minority among the 4 of these. But when I first came here 20 years ago, anytime there was a question, it was usually the Imam of the mosque who actually did answer it. And then we have people like Muhammad al-Masri who speaks for the entire Muslim population of Canada. But I think that this is a very good idea that you have 4 of us here with very differing views, that the diversity within the Muslim world is something that really is a blessing, and it must be appreciated and seen for what it is, because it has been there from the very existence of Islam. And it has been upheld and appreciated in different schools of thought, in different ways of thinking. And certainly that's how it should always be. I speak as a Muslim woman, hopefully they speak as the men.
Okay, right here, please.
Thank you. Very often in the Muslim debate, we speak about Islam in counter to the West. So if we're asking today, what is a moderate Muslim? My question is, what is a moderate Westerner?
What is it?
What is it? How do we define a modern Westerner?
How do we define a moderate Westerner? Okay, Mohammed, go ahead.
I think the question's amusing because, but it gets to the problem with the whole structure of the question. I really think that we should abandon the label of moderate Muslim, right, or moderate anybody, and ask, what are the kinds of standards that we expect people to abide by in a free and democratic society where we respect the rights of everybody, the equal rights of everybody? And then we can have a common yardstick, right? Is this person willing to respect the equal rights of everybody else? Is that person willing to respect the equal rights of everybody else? And I think that's what we should be striving for, whether they're Muslim, Jewish, Catholic, atheist, Sikh, Buddhist, Hindu, etc., right? We want to know, are you willing to live with others in a society characterized by free and equal rights for all?
Live and let live.
I think that this also points to a very interesting, in-depth idea this young gentleman has brought up when he says moderate Westerner. I mean, there are Muslims are Westerners. When you have third-generation Muslims in the West, there is really no difference between Muslims and the West. We are Western Muslims.
You are of the West?
We are of the West. So our thinking is very different. The thinking of my children is even more different. So, you know, it goes across the board. We're talking about the moderate Muslims is the topic that you brought up. So if you were to ask, do we ever speak about moderate Jews or moderate Christians or moderate Hindus? We don't. So certainly, why are we speaking about moderate Muslims? As I said in my first sentence, to be a Muslim is to be moderate. To be a Muslim is to be balanced.
I don't know, but I'm not sure that's accurate. People talk about right-wing Jews and left-wing Jews all the time.
But they're not moderate.
Well, let's just go this way in succession. Yeah, I'll kind of jump on that because perhaps it's an immigration thing that really what we're seeing. I'm born and raised here. My parents were not. The overwhelming majority of Jews and Christians who are here were born here. Their cultural background is from here. They have a number of generations. So in a lot of cases, we're dealing with, you know, on the line type of people, kids who are being born and raised here, identity issues that go with acculturation, pressures of assimilation. So we are at this stage at a very, very critical point. And so I think she's right in the sense that maybe it's because we're recently immigrated to Canada, Indo-Pak immigration, especially in the 70s, things like that.
I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Are you saying the longer the Muslim community is here, the more generations down the line we go, the more moderate/Western
I believe so, absolutely.
So?
Yep.
Go ahead.
Steve, here's where there's a problem. Almost every extremist that we know or participated was not a recent immigrant, or someone who was born in Canada or in Britain or in the United States. Major Nidal Hassan didn't come as an immigrant from someplace. The problem is that how do we define, what are the values that we hold absolutely certain? Gender equality, the notion of same-sex rights, this notion of separation of religion and state. You set these three parameters, and then you figure out where do you stand on that. If you believe that a woman's destiny is to be in the back row of the mosque, and when Rahil Raza leads the prayers, first Friday congregation prayers, the entire community boycotts that, and we have to have the prayers under police protection, that means that the vast majority of the folks have not yet reconciled to the question of gender equality. If there are Muslims, clerics screaming about against gays and lesbians in the Friday congregations and promising them hell and death, then we have a certain problem.
Okay, let me try this because we're down to about our last 6 minutes here, and I want to finish up on this. Here's the question: who speaks for Islam? Gallup did a survey. You like Gallup, right, Tarek? They're a pretty reputable organization. Don't tell me they're infested by them.
It was Dalia Mujahid who did this. You have to understand.
Gallup in 2008. Hang on, I was just, let's get into this. How important is religion in your daily life? Here come the countries. Egyptians, 98%. Indonesia, 96%. These are obviously Muslim-majority countries. Turkey, 86%. Okay, not so much here anymore. United States, 68%. United Kingdom, 28%. Here's the question: how likely is it that majority Muslim societies will allow for a diminishment of the role of religion in their public life?
Bangladesh is an answer. It had an election last year, 300 seats of parliament, the Islamists won only 2. The Prime Minister is a woman. The Supreme Court of Bangladesh has determined that no political party with a religious name can be allowed to function.
How has it happened there?
Because they are cut off from the nonsense that comes from the Muslim Brotherhood and the Pakistani Jamaat Islami. They came out of an oppression inflicted on them by fellow Muslims. You go to any part, you go to West Sahara, where Morocco is occupying Sahara now since 1974, you find a different construct of people who understand that their oppression is not coming because Israel is a state or the United States of America is the devil. They know that most of the oppression comes from fellow Muslims who have crushed them over the centuries. So Bangladesh is a prime example. Indonesia is a second example. They repeatedly rejected every Islamist that has come forward. The Indonesian president had to come up and say, we are not an Islamic country. Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam are part of the Indonesian fiber.
Let me get Mohammed on this.
I'm not sure exactly the point of your question. I think you were starting off saying that you're citing polling data saying that 98% of Egyptians say that religion
is extremely important in their life. Yes.
Indonesian is 96%.
Right.
And then you asked, is there any prospect that religion will have decreasing importance in the public life of these countries?
Yes.
I think those are two different questions, right? So the question sort of assumes that if you have a high degree of religious commitment, then you're necessarily going to have a high degree of religious sort of dominance of the public square, right?
Well, I mean, that's not a completely unreasonable statement to make,
it's not completely unreasonable, right? But I think it's problematic because it assumes that you can't have a functioning sort of public sphere unless you have a sharp decline in religiosity. If that's the case, then I think there'll be problems. But hopefully, what we can see is that in Muslim countries, people are able to, whatever their religiosity is, understand that the public sphere should be neutral with respect to how policy is made. Now, personally, if we talked about Egypt, I think one of the biggest agents for sectarianism is the government itself. And so I think it's a very complicated story. Every state is different.
Hopefully this will make it less complicated. You want to run this clip right now? This is Shadi Hamid from the Brookings Institution talking about the likelihood of a lesser role for religion in these societies. Michael, if you would, roll tape.
If we compare Islam to other religions, there's more support among Muslims for religion to play a larger role in public policy.
Right.
And I think in some sense you could even make the argument, and maybe I'm about to make it right now, that in some sense Muslims, at least at this current time, are somewhat immune to secularization. Secularization doesn't seem to be working. It generally hasn't worked in the Arab world. So I think for people who are sort of waiting out for a quote-unquote enlightenment in the Arab world, they might have
Reformation to hit.
The Reformation. Yeah. They might have to wait a very, very long time.
A very long time. So Mobeen, here's the question. We hear a lot about Islamofascism. Do you think Islamoliberalism is in the cards in our lifetime?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I think we should lead by example. We can teach that principles of liberal democracy are not at odds with Islam, especially. I have grown up with a very liberal democratic Islam, a direct result of being born here, raised here, educated here in a public secular system. So I do believe it. I think that if we live by example, we can show people that you don't necessarily have to suppress it, but you should exploit it in a positive way.
Having said all of what you just said, you have been honest enough to tell me in the past that you have felt the call of radicalism.
Yes.
Right? So?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny that I had the experience here. And maybe it's because I was spoiled, naive, idealistic, whatever it was. It took me going to live in the Middle East for 2 years for me to realize, ooh, I miss home. So,
Tariq.
India is the leading example of Muslim liberalism. India is the solution to our problems. And the fact that Indian Muslims and Indian Muslim leadership is never accounted for also stems from the implicit racism that exists against darker-skinned Muslims in the Middle East. Africans are considered low class, Indians are considered second-grade Muslims. The shorter and darker you get, the worse off you in the hierarchy of the Arab and the Islamic narrative of Islam. India, with what, 70 million Muslims, with leading academics, professors, millionaires, trade union activists, all living in a secular democracy, that is the answer. They're not being asked to give up their religion, and they are the most successful Muslims anywhere in the world.
Tariq, as is often the case when you do our programs, you get the last word on TV tonight.
Thank you very much.
Can I just take time before we flip over to our online segment to thank all of our guests for appearing here at the Monk School tonight. We're really grateful that you would come and share your views with us. I want to thank the audience for coming as well. You went to our website, you signed up, you came out, took time out of your busy schedules to join us tonight, and we're grateful that you did that as well.